Pode falar, Elisa.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Esta é mais uma sessão do nosso ciclo de debates Utopias e Distopias na Educação em Tempos de Pandemia, promovido pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Educação da Unicamp, com financiamento do programa CAP Sprint. Eu sou a professora Heloísa Rocha e vou coordenar os nossos trabalhos nesta sessão. Nossos agradecimentos especiais à nossa convidada de hoje, a professora Anne Svetkovic, por aceitar o nosso convite para falar sobre sentimentos públicos em tempos de pandemia. Vou começar apresentando a professora, situando alguns dos seus trabalhos e, em seguida, passarei a palavra a ela e depois abriremos para o debate. Eu vou me permitir começar a minha participação como moderadora desta sessão com um pequeno texto da escritora brasileira Clarice Lispector, que nasceu em 1920 e faleceu em 1977, cujo centenário de nascimento comemoramos este ano, com um amplo leque de eventos, como registrou a revista da FAPESP no seu número de outubro, numa matéria intitulada A Escritora das Entrelinhas. O texto que vou ler tem como título Quando Chorar. Foi publicado no Jornal do Brasil em setembro de 1967 e reunido no livro de crônicas A Descoberta do Mundo. Passo a citá-lo. Há um tipo de choro bom e há outro ruim. O ruim é aquele em que as lágrimas correm sem parar e, no entanto, não dão alívio, só esgotam e exaurem. Uma amiga perguntou-me se não seria esse choro como de uma criança com a angústia da fome. Era. Quando se está perto desse tipo de choro, é melhor procurar conter-se. Não vai adiantar. É melhor tentar fazer-se de forte e enfrentar. É difícil, mas ainda menos do que ir se tornando exangue a ponto de empalidecer. Mas nem sempre é preciso tornar-se forte. Temos que respeitar a nossa fraqueza. Então, são lágrimas suaves, de uma tristeza legítima à qual temos direito. Elas correm devagar e, quando passam pelos lábios, sente-se aquele gosto salgado, límpido, produto de nossa dor mais profunda. Homem chorar comove. Ele, o lutador, reconheceu sua luta, às vezes inútil. Respeito muito o homem que chora. Eu já vi homem chorar. Fecha aspas. Entre o que a escritora nomeia como o choro bom e o choro ruim, ela nos convida a reconhecer e respeitar as nossas fraquezas, lembrando que nem sempre é preciso tornar-se forte. Suas reflexões põem diante de nós o choro incontrolável da criança com a angústia da fome, o choro do homem ao reconhecer em alguns momentos a inutilidade de sua luta em uma sociedade que ensina aos meninos, desde muito cedo, que homem não chora. Diante da angústia da fome, das tristezas, da dor, do luto, do reconhecimento da inutilidade de algumas lutas, que caminho podemos tomar? Conter-se? Fazer-se de forte? Enfrentar? Conceder-se o direito da tristeza legítima? Provar o sabor da nossa dor mais profunda? Talvez pudéssemos nos perguntar: por que choramos? O que nos comove? O que nos faz sofrer? Referindo-se ao que denomina como iconografia do sofrimento, a escritora estadunidense Susan Sontag, numa análise pungente sobre o bombardeio de representações da dor e do sofrimento a que estamos expostos cotidianamente, numa obra intitulada Diante da Dor dos Outros, afirma que é necessária, e eu estou citando a Sontag, uma vasta reserva de estoicismo para percorrer as notícias de um grande jornal a cada manhã, dada a probabilidade de ver fotos capazes de nos fazer chorar. Fecha aspas. Essa reserva é ainda mais necessária no tempo presente, marcado pela proliferação de imagens da doença e da morte nas diferentes latitudes do globo, resultantes da devastadora propagação de um novo vírus, ao lado das recorrentes cenas de violência contra mulheres, crianças, negros, indígenas, pobres, gays, lésbicas e tantos outros sujeitos que vivem a sua sexualidade em desacordo com os padrões de normalidade estabelecidos socialmente. O respeito às nossas fraquezas, sugerido por Clarice Lispector, ou a vasta reserva de estoicismo proposta por Sontag, me possibilitam uma primeira aproximação das reflexões que N. Svetkovich nos proporcionará sobre os sentimentos públicos no atual contexto de pandemia, marcado por enormes desafios no cenário político. Respondendo a Martha Bell Wasserman, que lhe pergunta sobre o significado de arriscar no trabalho acadêmico, em uma entrevista publicada sob o título Navegando pelo Arquivo com N. Svetkovich, que coincide com o título de uma exposição sobre arte e cultura queer em Los Angeles, de 1945 a 1980, nossa convidada afirma: preciso lembrar que ser persistente diante de nos sentirmos mal conosco mesmos é um ato de bravura. Me interessa pensar sobre a depressão em termos de sentimentos cotidianos, como o ódio de nós mesmos que muitas vezes nos oprime. A batalha contra esses sentimentos também faz parte da batalha contra a violência sistêmica maior. É aí que reside a depressão política. Então, as reflexões propostas por N sobre esses sentimentos cotidianos em várias de suas obras e intervenções artísticas podem ser compreendidas no âmbito da virada afetiva, nomeada a partir do trabalho das sociólogas estadunidenses Patricia Clough e Jim Haley como Effective Turn, concebido como um giro nas formas de pensar e interpretar a realidade social. Giro esse traduzido pelo pesquisador inglês Kurs Van como uma nova compreensão dos seres humanos e das políticas da vida. Essa virada afetiva se configura em uma expressão do questionamento da primazia do logos na formação dos sujeitos, em resposta a um fenômeno que os pesquisadores Mônica Greco e Paul Stener, em trabalho de 2008, nomeiam como emocionalização da vida pública. A expressão procura dar conta do papel crescente e crucial das emoções na transformação das esferas da vida pública, e nas diversas esferas, tais como os meios de comunicação, a saúde, a esfera legal, entre tantas outras. As possibilidades de reflexão que vêm sendo produzidas a partir desse giro, voltadas para a indagação sobre aquilo que se sente, ganharam impulso a partir da última década, traduzindo-se no crescente interesse pelo estudo dos afetos, das emoções, dos sentimentos, na confluência entre distintas áreas do conhecimento. Esse interesse se expressa por meio de um conjunto de questões que incidem tanto sobre a dimensão corporal das emoções, como sobre os significados atribuídos a elas pelos indivíduos em relação com os padrões de significação elaborados socialmente. É importante pensar que, longe de se configurar em um modismo, a interrogação sobre a dimensão afetiva, que passou a ocupar lugar de destaque na agenda dos estudiosos das ciências sociais e dos historiadores, se constitui, como propõem os pesquisadores da Universidade de Barcelona, Ali Lara e Guiazú Enciso Domingues, em um indicador simultâneo das modificações na vida pública, na experiência subjetiva, mas com impactos também sobre a produção do conhecimento. No caso específico da história das emoções, historiadores como Jan Plumper, da Goldsmiths University of London, assinalam o efeito catalisador do traumático 11 de setembro de 2001 para o interesse cada vez mais amplo pelo estudo das emoções. Esse episódio teria operado como uma espécie de choque de realidade, pondo em cena o que os comentaristas conceberam como um universo de emoções fanáticas e desgovernadas, e abalando os pilares sobre os quais se erigiu a modernidade, expressos em uma crença na expansão crescente da racionalidade, acompanhada do recuo paulatino da dimensão emocional. Os estudos nessa área têm possibilitado remarcar a historicidade das emoções e dos sentimentos, bem como da linguagem que usamos para expressá-los. Os historiadores franceses, organizadores da coleção Histoire des Émotions, Jean-Jacques Courtine, Georges Vigarello e Alain Corbin, assinalam nessa direção que, embora as emoções possam ser tomadas como experiências comuns, como reações aparentemente partilhadas, não se pode perder de vista que os significados atribuídos às emoções, suas formas, suas nuances, sua intensidade, variam conforme a cultura e o tempo histórico. Em outros termos, como nos lembra a historiadora alemã Judith Frevert, as emoções têm história e as emoções fazem história. E a historiadora alemã, nesse sentido, ela quer nos lembrar da importância de se atentar para as distinções em relação às formas como as emoções são experienciadas historicamente, as expressões emocionais, as ações e a linguagem das emoções, que inclui não somente os enunciados, mas também os gestos e as expressões faciais. Enfim, é no âmbito desses deslocamentos que tem convocado, a atenção dos estudiosos para a dimensão afetiva da vida em sociedade, que Anne Svetkovich tem refletido sobre sentimentos públicos como a depressão, examinada, por exemplo, na obra Depression, a Public Feeling, numa perspectiva que leva a pensá-la, pensar a depressão como um fenômeno social, um fenômeno cultural, enfim, como uma categoria histórica. Seus estudos têm oferecido alternativas para pensar a depressão para além das análises correntes, ancoradas nos modelos médicos, muitas vezes orientados segundo o viés da patologização da experiência humana. E, nesse sentido, seus trabalhos vêm propondo um deslocamento também da reflexão do espaço do privado para a esfera da política, e buscando, por essa via, indagar sobre as relações entre a depressão e as histórias de colonialismo, de genocídio, de escravidão, de exclusão e segregação. O papel das emoções na esfera pública e na vida política e a indagação sobre o poder afetivo dos documentos de arquivo têm sido aspectos centrais nos estudos da pesquisadora, os quais têm buscado atentar para as relações entre o emocional, o cultural e o político, com base nos aportes dos estudos feministas e da teoria queer. Exemplar nesse sentido é o vídeo The Alphabet of Feeling Bad, dirigido por Carrie Michalski, no qual a atuação de Anne possibilita recensear de A a Z sentimentos negativos do dia a dia, como o A de ansiedade, seguido, por exemplo, de depressão, solidão, pavor, raiva, sensação de estar refém de uma situação, como em um beco sem saída, de se sentir entorpecido ou incapaz de trabalhar, de estar sobrecarregado de tantas demandas, de não estar satisfeito, enfim, de não estar se sentindo bem, entre outras possibilidades. Tais sentimentos são examinados não como expressão de um fracasso individual, nem tampouco como uma doença, mas como sentimentos públicos, em cuja análise devem estar presentes, defende Anne, questões como as condições de trabalho, homofobia, o racismo. Emoções e sentimentos como frustração, tristeza, raiva, ansiedade, medo, vergonha, culpa, também estão presentes nas reflexões da pesquisadora sobre o luto e a militância lésbica contra a AIDS, numa perspectiva que procura compreender a experiência do trauma, do sofrimento associado à morte, à perda e à própria doença, para além de uma visão medicalizada ou patologizada, escrevendo-a na discussão sobre, aspas, a construção de novas identidades e comunidades, fecha aspas, alicerçadas na crítica aos padrões normativos de sexualidade que atravessaram a forma como a sociedade lidou com a AIDS. Enfim, volto a Susan Sontag. Refletindo sobre os efeitos da iconografia do sofrimento, Sontag adverte que a quantidade de imagens do sofrimento a que as pessoas estão expostas cotidianamente não é responsável pela sua insensibilização. Segundo ela, e passo a citar a autora, é a passividade que embota o sentimento. Os estados definidos como apatia, anestesia moral ou emocional são repletos de sentimentos. Os sentimentos são raiva e frustração. Mas se ponderarmos quais emoções seriam desejáveis, parece demasiado simples escolher a solidariedade. No entanto, ainda conforme essa autora, na mesma medida em que sentimos solidariedade, sentimos não ser cúmplices daquilo que causou o sofrimento. Nossa solidariedade proclama nossa inocência, assim como proclama nossa impotência. Nessa medida, a despeito de todas as nossas boas intenções, ela pode ser uma reação impertinente, se não imprópria. Fecha aspas, a citação da Sontag. Imprópria, sobretudo, se não considerar que a privação e o sofrimento de alguns estão irremediavelmente relacionados à riqueza de outros, ou, em outros termos, às desiguais condições de existência. Para não perder o contato com a escritora Clarice Lispector, que tem me acompanhado em alguns desses dias de pandemia, cito o texto Não Sentir, publicado também no Jornal do Brasil, no mesmo ano, 1967, que guarda importantes conexões com o que Anne nomeia como entorpecimento mortal, num texto sobre a militância contra a AIDS. Bom, citando Lispector, o hábito tem amortecido as quedas, mas sentindo menos dor, perdeu a vantagem da dor como aviso e sintoma. Hoje em dia, vive incomparavelmente mais sereno, porém, em grande perigo de vida. Pode estar a um passo de estar morrendo, a um passo de já ter morrido e sem o benefício de seu próprio aviso prévio. Retomando o diálogo de Anne com Martha-Bell Wasserman, lembro que nossa convidada sugere algumas práticas com as quais se tece o enfrentamento do que denomina como depressão política. Citando, então, Anne, construir hábitos diários de sobrevivência é uma prática que nos fará avançar. O uso da arte ou da escuta, ou quaisquer ferramentas que tenhamos para criar sociabilidades, é realmente importante, tanto em uma escala íntima como em uma dimensão mais ampla. Quiçá, um antídoto contra o entorpecimento mortal a que ela se refere, ou os riscos de estar morrendo sem o benefício do próprio aviso prévio, como sugere a escritora brasileira. É com grande satisfação, então, que recebemos neste ciclo de debates para falar sobre sentimentos públicos a professora Anne Zvektovic, me perdi um pouquinho, que é atualmente diretora do Instituto Pauline Dewitt, de Estudos Feministas e de Gênero, na Universidade de Carleton, em Ottawa, Canadá. Ela foi professora de inglês do Ellen Clayton Garwood Centennial e professora de estudos feministas e de gênero na Universidade do Texas, em Austin, onde foi diretora fundadora do programa de estudos LGBTQ, lançado em 2017. É autora de Mixed Feelings, 1992, Depression, a Public Feeling, 2012, organizou com Anne Pellegrini Public Sentiments, uma edição especial do The Scholar and Feminist Online, e com Janet Steiger e Annie Reynolds, Political Emotions, 2010, que está disponível no acervo do Núcleo de Estudos de Gênero PAGU. Esqueci de falar que na Archive of Feelings está disponível na biblioteca do IFCH da Unicamp. Anne foi ainda coeditora com Ana Marie Jagose do GLQ, a Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies. Seus projetos de escrita se concentram no estado atual dos arquivos LGBTQ e no uso criativo deles por parte de artistas para criar contra-arquivos e intervenções em história pública. Eu passo, então, a palavra à professora Anne e desejo um excelente trabalho. Seja muito bem-vinda, Anne. Obrigada.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can start now. And do you hear us?
Now I can, yeah.
Okay.
No, this is good. I don't know what happened with my laptop, but so I had to switch to my phone, which means I can't really see a big gallery, but it's okay, it works. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, all right. So I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but this is how it goes with our times of Zoom in a pandemic. So I'm afraid I've missed some of what Eloisa was saying, and I'll have to catch up later. But perhaps she can also repeat where necessary, maybe after I do a bit of my intro. So first of all, I want to thank you for the miracle of being able to visit with you in Brazil, even with technical difficulties. And I want to thank Eloisa for the invitation. Very honored to have people be interested in my work from Brazil. I also want to thank Adriana for the translation. Because I don't take that for granted. And if you could use the chat, I'm on my phone, so it's more difficult to see the chat, but it helps me to know that people are able to see. I had planned to also type into the chat, but I may not be able to do that. So I did want to, what I plan to do is to ultimately present to you a little bit of the work that I have been doing since the pandemic began with a group which is called Public Feelings, which is a group of my comrades and colleagues at the University of Texas, where I was a professor until very recently. I just relocated to Canada, where I was born and raised, less than 2 years ago. So actually, I've spent a good deal of the time since my return to Canada under conditions of pandemic and with closed borders. So that has been quite an experience. I'm very glad that I was able to meet Eloisa before that time. She came to a conference in Ottawa, and I think that's how she became familiar with my work and invited me to be with you here today. So as I was saying, I've been working with a group in Austin at the University of Texas, doing what we call writing salons, where we share 500-word pieces with each other periodically. And I was very much missing that group anyway when I came to Ottawa. And one of the values of the pandemic is that it has been possible to connect with each other long distance. And so I've been able to meet with that group monthly to share work since the pandemic began. And what I'm ultimately wanting to do is to share with you 2 different installments of some work around the, I hope there's Portuguese new vocabulary for this, a meme or a hashtag called in English, and again, this is where the translation is interesting, but in English, people have been using the term COVID silver linings to describe what might be certain kinds of positive experiences, even in conditions of pandemic. And I was doing this work anyway, but when Eloisa invited me under the rubric of utopias and dystopias that is part of this series, it seemed to me that it was quite relevant to the work that I think that you are doing. I so wish I could be with you because given the nature of my work on affect, sensation, feeling, which I'm sorry to miss Eloise's summary, but what I heard sounded very beautifully on track as a description of the work that I have been doing really over the course of my career. And oh, I lost my thought because I'm looking out my window. Yeah, it's been very interesting to be able to do this work around COVID silver linings, the notion of utopia and dystopia as combined together. Now, if I were with you, that's what I was starting to say, is that Zoom is great. I mean, in a way, Zoom is a kind of COVID silver lining to the extent that I'm seeing someone writing in Portuguese in the chat. Someone will have to translate. If I could be with you, we would have that kinesthetic connection. I know Eloisa was talking about the importance of the corporeal, and for me, that is an important part of what people have been calling in the Anglophone world the affective turn in theory, which basically, in short, is just an undoing of the Cartesian binary between mind and body, or cognition and emotion. And certainly my career has been devoted to that critique of a Western philosophical tradition. I think it's a intellectual exploration that is cross-cultural and interdisciplinary. So that's why I am glad to have the opportunity to be in discussion with people sitting in Brazil, even if I can't be there with you, because I think especially now, we really are in a situation where we're all experiencing this global pandemic, but it's lived differently in different places. And so the possibility of sharing our experiences with one another, even by the limited capacity in some ways with respect to the senses of Zoom, is a great opportunity. So I wanted to also signal as a kind of a two-way street in the discussion, some of the reasons why, even though I don't speak Portuguese, I haven't been to Brazil, and I am not a Latin American specialist. Nonetheless, work that is going on in Brazil has been very important to me. So I just wanted to sketch out a few ways in which I think we would be in a position to have an interesting discussion. One of these is that I think of Brazil within the context of the Americas as one of the most important places to think about a comparative history of colonialism and genocide. So Portuguese exploration or journeys to the Americas, beginning with landing in or settlement in Brazil, is a very important phenomenon for all of us to understand. Here in North America, both in the US and in Canada, I have been very interested in what we call the afterlife of slavery, which and including its affective or emotional legacies. And I'm thinking here about the category of trauma, which has been important to my work, and notions of historical trauma. This would be one aspect of my work on affect, feeling, and emotion that is very important in a comparative context. Now, I think Eloisa was also starting to talk about work on gender and sexuality, and my work also comes out of queer studies, and there the work in Brazil around alternative genders is very important. Also very important has been work on HIV/AIDS activism, which has been extremely important to my scholarship. And there, I think what I have learned about the specificity of the response to HIV/AIDS in Brazil has been very interesting. And also, I think what I have found very important for comparative discussions, this is turning from my work on trauma to work on depression, which I think is one of the things that people have found interesting about my work, including my collective work with other groups, is whether to think of depression as a clinical or medical category, or to think of it as a cultural and social category. And there I have found very interesting the possibility of cross-cultural or transcultural discussions of the use of pharmaceuticals, so the global drug industry, and diagnoses of depression, which from my conversations with scholars in Latin America, I understand there to be very high diagnoses and pharmaceutical prescriptions, but also interesting work on cultural and social approaches to depression, anxiety, loneliness, etc. Many of these being feelings which are part of the legacy, again, of longer histories of colonialism, exploitation, indigenous genocide, and so on. So this is why, for me, these opportunities to have cross-cultural discussion are very important. Of course, we all find ourselves in pandemic conditions, but differently lived or experienced. We also find ourselves with problematic governments. So I'm thinking of the problem of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the links to Trump or Trumpism in the US, Putin in Russia. So this issue of authoritarian regimes in the 21st century is something that is very important, and another reason why we might want to have a comparative discussion of political feelings. That is, how are we feeling with the systems and regimes that we are living in? So one of the fundamental questions for me in my work in public feelings has been to approach systemic conditions by which we might understand racial capitalism, its history and its lived experience, to ask how is that experienced from the vantage point of sensational or felt or lived experience. That is a structuring question for my work, and one that has been very relevant to the experience of the pandemic, or what has been called in the US context. I still operate often with a very US-based framework because of having lived there for half of my life, and also because of the power of the US globally. So many people have been talking about the twin pandemics of the COVID-19, but also of systemic racism. And so that has been very interesting to me to explore. Oh, I see someone is putting up some of my writing, so that's good. I did want to hold up two of the books that are best known. So here's Archive of Feelings, and that has actually been translated into Spanish, which might be of use to some people. In Spain, I couldn't find the book on my shelf, or I would hold it up. And then also there is Depression of Public Feeling is the other big monograph on public feelings. And you can look on my website for more information. There's also, this maybe, I don't know if it would be known, this is, can you read it? This is in Spanish, a collection on affect that was published out of Argentina. And I have been doing some work with Brazilian scholars. I have a piece about oral history that may be coming out in a Brazilian anthology. And I've also had interesting discussions with people there about cultures of public memory. Indeed, that's, of course, a very important issue everywhere, but I think the specific urgencies in Brazil are very interesting. Okay, so can someone give me a time check? That is, how long have I spoken now, and how much longer should I speak for? Even in the chat? I'm not seeing a response, so I'll keep going, but maybe someone
Anne,
can put in the chat.
Sinta-se tranquila, pode seguir.
Okay, great. This is, yeah, I had planned to say some comments about the cross-cultural dialogue with the Brazilian context. So I hope that's something that maybe people will be willing to discuss in the debate, because of course, for me, one of the disadvantages of not being with you is not being able to have the back and forth that would allow me to situate my own work in relation to your discussions there. Then my second goal was to tell you a little bit about the background, but I think Eloisa is doing that. People are putting things in the chat. So hopefully, if nothing else from the discussion today, you get a little bit of a sense of the work that I have been doing and whether it might be of interest to you, assuming that it is accessible in English, and or some of it may be available to you in Portuguese soon, if not already. So what I'm going to do now is to read the two pieces on COVID silver linings that I've written with my public feelings group. I'm going to describe a couple of other pieces, and apologies, Adriana, I sent some of these to you in advance for the translation, but I've decided, for interest of time, I'm just going to describe them, also because a number of them have very local references, so may be hard to translate in the more cultural sense for you. So I'll read two, and then we'll see, kind of where we are. And I may also, when I finish reading, want to explain some of the cultural references, but feel free to ask me if there are things in here that just are, some of them are going to be very foreign, but to me, this is part of this work of trying to document public feelings in a time of pandemic, is starting from our very local positions, which in many ways are even more local because we can't travel, because we're not supposed to be with each other. So here I am. Okay, now we have the problem of, because I switched to my phone, I'm going to potentially run out of battery power. So before I begin, I'm going to have to plug in my phone, which means I also have to switch to a different pair of headphones. So bear with me just a moment. That work? Adriana, can you still hear me? Great. Okay. Yep. I just am going to have, this is the thing about Zoom, is you have to be very flexible. So am I? I know, sorry. I know. This is, it's the problem of being on the phone. I'll try to hold still while I read. Okay, so now, Adriana, I hope this will be a little bit easier for you because I'm going to be reading from my text. I mean, in a sense, we are, on a ship that is swinging. So, okay, so this is called COVID Silver Linings. This is the first piece I wrote with my public feelings group. And so it's dated April 9th, which seems so very long ago in pandemic time. But it's, given me a lot to think about. Okay, so COVID Silver Linings has rapidly become a new meme or hashtag, and is directly related to my work on dialectics of hope and despair, pessimism and utopia, or we could say utopia and dystopia, to use the words of your series, or as we have often been discussing in affect theory, positive and negative affects. So there's been a lot of discussion about the relation between the positive and the negative in thinking about different affects. So the phrase COVID silver linings also takes me back to Marx's thinking about capitalism as sowing the seeds, or we might say viruses now, of its own destruction and bringing into being possibilities for liberation. For Marx specifically, the conditions of factory production brought workers together in ways that could enable gatherings for purposes of political revolt, such as unions and strikes. Even without the new protocols of social distancing, that version of public gathering seems to have withered considerably under current regimes. And I'm referring to the fact that, at least in North America, unions become increasingly rare, although they still exist in Canada, much more so than in the US, where there has been a systematic crushing of unions. So here too, this is interesting for cross-cultural comparison, is just the status of Marxism as a radical social imaginary and the way in which this issue of dialectics of hope and despair, or utopia, dystopia, comes from a Marxist tradition, or whether there might be other sources for thinking about those affectively laden categories. Now, the other example for COVID silver linings within cultural theory that I'm going to offer to you is taken from a more specifically US context. This is the LGBTQ or gay theorist, John D'Amelio. If I could type in the chat, I'd put his name. But he wrote a very important essay in the 1970s. It's quite old now, but a classic essay called Capitalism and Gay Identity. And his argument there was that urban settlements and war, especially World War II in the United States, made it possible for people to leave their families and circulate in new and different ways. So this allowed for more flexible intimacies, such as same-sex cruising and cohabitation. So this is a major foundation for LGBT history in the US and other parts of North America, is this idea that, for example, in the US, the Stonewall riots of 1969 that many people cite as the beginning of LGBTQ politics were in fact a part of a longer history that included social mobility and movement, especially after World War II. And again, this is where I think comparison with other locations, including Brazil, is very interesting. I also note here that there's a kind of logic here about capitalism's socialist silver lining having to do with people gathering together to create publics of various kinds, including intimate and affective ones. So in the case of Marx, it could be unions in the factories. In the case of LGBTQ politics, it could be cruising, bars, and urban life. So this gives us a bit of a challenge in times of pandemic, because it seems to be that our COVID silver linings will have to be a function of social distance, or about alternate socialities. So how might the pandemic be an opportunity not just for truncated or interrupted forms of the social, but for new forms of the social? But could those social forms be the asocial, or the antisocial, or the retreat, or the withdrawal, or the refusal or rejection of the social? So that's a question I want to ask. Another hashtag, I assume there's a Portuguese word for hashtag, um, for those of you on social media. Okay, great. Okay, good to know. So another hashtag that's popular in English is together apart. Um, and with an emphasis on remaining together, perhaps in some more metaphorical way, in spite of being apart. This also reminds me of another important queer theorist who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, Douglas Crimp. One of his most important essays for me is called Mourning and Militancy, about political feeling and the coexistence of grief and anger, or activism and mourning. And he has written about the phenomenon of coming together to stay apart, and with a bit more of a dystopian edge to it, where queer theorists in the US have been very interested in the difficulty of the social or the antisocial. So it's not that kind of upbeat, like, yay, we're all together, but more about the difficulties of the social and cultural formations that include isolation or separation. So depending on how closely you are following developments in queer theory in the United States that have been very important for affect theory, you might or might not be familiar with debates about the antisocial in queer theory. So Jose Munoz, who's a very important queer theorist, actually his new book, published posthumously, called The Sense of Brown, is just out, and again, I think would be very interesting for those in South America and Latin America to read, because it's about affective understandings of racial identities, particularly what are now being called in the US Latinx identities. I'm really interested in this debate about the antisocial. Another theorist who's important here would be Lauren Berlant, also Lee Edelman, in their book called Sex or the Unbearable, where they write about non-sovereignty or about the difficulty of the social. So taking this back to our conditions in times of pandemic, so those of us who might be struggling with new forms of domesticity, especially, this is especially a gendered phenomenon right now, with women who are working and also having to do childcare. There's a lot of news reports coming out about this in North America. I would be curious to know what's going on in Brazil. So this idea of being at home with the family, maybe some utopian ideal, is often become very dystopian in times of pandemic, as people are not having very much fun within their domestic contexts. Of course, from the perspective of queer theory, there's long been a critique of certainly compulsory heterosexuality or normative forms of the family. So those of us who work in queer affect studies might well have tools for understanding why being confined to the domestic might not be such a good thing. So for me, phrases like COVID silver linings or being together or apart need to cut both ways, or this is a very English, just have a double meaning. And it's very important that COVID silver linings not become completely utopian or optimistic. So I like to think of it as retaining the aura or the specter of negativity. Now, I'll say a little bit about my situation. I first started thinking about COVID silver linings because my own situation in working from home, which has become another hashtag in English, working from home, or even WFH, the initials. I have been very lucky. I'm one of the people who has a salaried job that has not been in jeopardy. I have a space in which to work in my home. I do not have children. And so, at least in April, in the beginning of the pandemic, I was very happy to be working at home, to not have the forced march of working from 9 in the morning to 5 at night. I do an administrative job, and I was finding that very weary. I find myself to be not very productive in the office, so I prefer to work at home. I do not like commuting to work. I don't like the time I have to spend, making lunch and getting dressed and getting transportation and so on. Particularly here in Canada, I returned from Texas, which has much warmer climate. So going to the work in the winter has been very hard. In fact, I grew up here, so it's not completely unfamiliar, but I have found myself kind of reminded of my childhood of being in the snow, being at school, and often having what I call low-level forms of feeling bad or depression. So these are some of the things I was thinking about for my own condition. And certainly as the notion of COVID silver linings has continued to circulate in discussions of the pandemic, I still have had to acknowledge, like, we can critique my position from the vantage point of class and race. That is, I have a great deal of privilege, but I also have been grateful for the pause or the interruption in ordinary routines that the pandemic has brought, particularly the commitment to work and productivity and workaholism. So again, to the extent that the pandemic allows us to live a different relation to capitalism, I think it does have some interesting silver linings. So I've been thinking about this also in terms of these larger theoretical questions of the positive and the negative. Is our need to find a silver lining a form of what Lauren Berlant would call cruel optimism? That is an optimism or something good that, in fact, is not in our own interests, is in fact cruel. She suggests that we often reach for the very things that are going to kill us. Is COVID silver linings like, this is again a very US reference, but thinking of the pink ribbons that particularly women cancer survivors wear. So the use of that notion of warriors or survivors that surrounds cancer treatment in the US. So this may be a very American phenomenon, this tendency to want to always put a happy face onto everything, including the pandemic. In our public feelings work, we have tended to move in some different directions. In thinking about depression as a political phenomenon, we have wanted to make space for the impasse, for numbness and despair. But in this time of pandemic, it has been important to forge resources of hope, which include creative activities, resting, other ways to have time out. I also think it's been an interesting time to think about new forms of the social, new forms of survival, new forms of resilience, and different ways of working together. There is also a kind of optimism or perhaps utopian thinking in the belief that social distancing will make a difference, that adherence to it is dependent on staving off the seductive pull of the death drive of risky behavior that I am familiar with from HIV/AIDS activism. And here I think there's so much to learn, right? For example, practices of safer sex, of wearing condoms, are, I think, very interesting to look at in relation to maintaining social distance or wearing masks. So what is it about human behavior that makes it very difficult for people to do the very things that might keep them safe? So while we might develop strategies for safer social distancing, like we did for safer sex, we also know that some will be less compliant due to despair, addiction, or lack of economic and material resource. And still, the queer utopian in me wants to see the gay choreographers put in charge of the dance of social distancing as we figure out new ways to move together in space with our gloves and our masks, taking on as our partner Miss Rona. That's what my gay friends have been calling the COVID-19, is Miss Rona. Miss Rona with her fabulous red clusters and crowns. Okay, that was a somewhat slow reading of that piece, in part because I wanted to, it's very interesting for me to hear myself read it to this audience and to think about what I would want to explain in order to move across cultures. I'm gonna pause there for a moment and get maybe another time check, because the one other piece I would want to read is the COVID silver linings now. That is in the last couple of weeks, as the US has been dealing with the election of Trump, and also with my first version was written in April, so it was before the death of George Floyd in the United States and the massive uprisings of the movement for Black Lives. And again, I would be very interested to hear whether and how those anti-Black racism protests in the United States have had an impact in Brazil. So that is the one other piece I could read quickly. Is there time for me to do that, Eloisa?
Temos tempo, Anne, pode continuar.
Okay, so I'll just say before I go on that I wanted to mention two of the other pieces I wrote, because if we had a bit more time, or I could, you know, have the technology work better, I wanted to, sometimes what I do is produce this as a kind of writing workshop. So I do want to leave you with some writing suggestions that you could do on your own. And so, you know, obviously you might think about or write about this notion of COVID silver linings. So have there been COVID silver linings for you in your experience of the pandemic? The other a question or topic I would be interested to share with you if we were sitting in a small group would be, what are your, we often work with keywords, right? Like, what are your pandemic keywords and what are your pandemic feelings? I love to just ask people to put them in the chat, right? And also I love doing this in other languages, because the you know, affective languages tend to be very culturally specific. So really hearing what you would say in Portuguese for, you know, one word for how you are feeling right now today. Oh yeah, so, and I can, so tristeza, I sometimes I can get the romance cognates. All of those words are so very important. Agora estou feliz. Yeah, exactly. So these are the multiple feelings that we all might have. And so, of course, each one of those terms could be a very important keyword. What is cansazo? No, what was that? Yeah, okay, yeah. So this notion of like fatigue and exhaustion, I think, is very, very important for us during this time of pandemic. Um, so one topic is, agonia. One
Adriana, ela está podendo ler o que está aparecendo no chat?
So this question of how are we feeling is very important. And then the two topics I found very interesting in May, June, July were performance. So as we had to shrink, for me, culture and performance, live performance is so very important. And so as we had to stay home, I found myself just going to things via Zoom and just logging like what are the performances or the live culture that is sustaining me in this time, even if just in Zoom. So that might be another thing that would be very interesting for you to log or monitor. And then the other issue for me was protest. So once there were protests happening in the US, and I was in Canada where there were also protests and marches around anti-racism. Here in Canada, there's huge attention to issues of Indigenous sovereignty. There's a huge problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women, so very high rates of death, specifically for Indigenous women that have been the subject of an inquiry here in Canada. And so the fact that people took to the streets was really amazing, particularly in this time. And I found myself thinking a lot about other protests. Sometimes I would have to travel there in my mind or my memory because I couldn't be on the street, and I wanted to be in New York, which is very important to me. I wanted to be in Austin, where I used to live, and I couldn't. So also very interesting for me as a writing topic was cultures of protest, which are also cultures of performance. So I just wanted to mention those two topics because I would be very interested in anything that people there have to say about protest and performance in time of pandemic. But now I'm going to go to my second version of COVID Silver Linings, and I'm actually working on this now. So you're the first people I'm sharing this with. My public feelings group will meet in a couple of weeks, and I'll probably workshop it with them. But I'm also writing for a special issue of the journal Theory and Event for a forum on pandemic keywords. So I wanted to work with this idea of COVID silver linings. Adriana, with some apologies to you, in the interest of time, I'm going to read as quickly as I can while also, okay. Yes, I know. So, okay, thank you for that. Then I will try to read quite slowly. And please, if you just wave at me or something, if it's too fast, and I'll slow down, okay? Yeah. This is also actually very important, this issue of translation and access in a time of pandemic. I found it very interesting to think about categories of disability and slowing down. So I'm glad actually that Adriana asked me to go slowly, because I think it is important right now to take time, take rest, take pause wherever we can. Actually, I'm just gonna pause for a minute. It would be good if there were two translators. Yeah, take a little break. Okay, wonderful. I will also get my my glass of water. Actually, we're very lucky. It's sunny here in Ontario. Okay. Yeah. So since I wrote in April, much has changed, but much has stayed the same as the pandemic remains not only very much with us, but surging upward and onward. With a recent news about a vaccine, there is a possible end in sight, but only an end to the medical version of the pandemic, not, I don't think, the social version of the pandemic. That will remain with us. So one of the phrases that has come to mind is that of my AIDS activist friend, Greg Bordowitz. He has a slogan which is, the AIDS crisis is just beginning. And he's referring to an earlier slogan, the AIDS crisis is not over. And this is something that became popular amongst HIV/AIDS activists in the US, because even with the discovery and circulation of drugs that could not cure, but stop the symptoms of HIV/AIDS, still there is a medical crisis. And again, I know Brazil has had a very interesting history with the distribution of drugs and medication, but I will just say HIV/AIDS remains a pandemic, even with medical solutions, because we are still dealing with health disparities that operate on economic lines, racial lines, cultural and social lines. So also, since I wrote in April, I'm paraphrasing a little bit my writing here, because I mentioned to you already that the murder of George Floyd and the accompanying political uprisings has been very important, as well as in the US context, what we hope is the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and Trump gone, we hope. We don't know. The next few months will be interesting. So this is a time where there's constant, this may be part of our feelings, right? And even in the chat, we see, positive and negative feelings, feeling up, feeling down. We see the graphs that are going up and down with numbers of deaths, numbers of illnesses, and so on. And so even if we are experiencing on an individual basis some kind of COVID silver lining, we are still living inside of the many storms or black clouds that are created by the pandemic, or even we could say climate change comes into place here. I wanted to refer also to another phrase that I think is closely related to this idea of COVID silver linings, and that is from the South Asian writer Arundhati Roy, who coined a phrase which has circulated quite widely, which is the pandemic as portal. And I think that concept, I hope it's come to Brazil. She's very widely read around the world. And many people in progressive circles have been very interested in this idea that the pandemic might be a portal to another world, that we don't want to go back to the world as it was. We don't want to go back to the normal. Eloisa was also in the section I heard discussing the anti-normativity of queer affect theory and the desire to interrupt business as usual. So I wonder if in the US context at least, will the pandemic have been a portal to new forms of anti-racism, anti-capitalism, anti-Black racism's possibilities also for Indigenous sovereignty. We don't know yet, but it's very interesting to begin at least to speculate. On the other hand, and this is where, it's never one or the other, it's always this dialectic swinging back and forth. every step forward seems to produce backlash. So the election of Barack Obama in the US produced a huge backlash that arguably is what led to the election of Trump. And it's possible that the election of Biden and Harris in the US will produce, because 70 million people in the US voted for Trump. So there is still considerable popular support for anti-racist and capitalist political formations. So here we have to find cause for hope where we can. And two of the bodies of work that have been most important to me for thinking about this issue are Black feminisms. And again, this would be interesting to compare the state of Black feminisms in the Brazilian context with the North American context, and then also referring back to my first piece on COVID silver linings. The work of HIV and queer activists is very important. So one of my research projects during this time of pandemic has been to participate in an oral history project based in New York, for which I have been interviewing some of my AIDS activist peers and fellow travelers in order to hear what they have to say about the relation between the HIV/AIDS pandemic and this pandemic. I would just conclude by saying that ultimately we cannot know or control whether or not there are COVID silver linings or whether the pandemic will be a portal. The dialectical coexistence of not just positive and negative moods and structures, but multiple and sometimes competing realities and scales calls for what I would say an openness to not knowing. That is one of the practices that I think we have to cultivate right now, is not knowing the future and sometimes not knowing how we feel. And this multiplicity, right? This is what's very special to me about even via Zoom being in conversation with you, all sitting in quite a different context than mine. So your feelings and structures of feeling are not going to be the same as mine necessarily. And so just that openness to not knowing may be the best we can do, rather than deciding definitively, oh, this is a condition of hope, this is a condition of despair, oh, this is utopia, oh, this is dystopia. Instead, it is just this attitude of not knowing that I think is going to be one of our best steps forward. Okay, I will stop there. Because I'm just looking at my little phone, I have no idea what time it is or where we are with the discussion. So I will rely on Eloisa, to take it from here. Maybe we pause for a minute.
Anne, muitíssimo obrigada. É um privilégio tê-la conosco e foi um privilégio ouvir suas reflexões sobre sentimentos públicos em tempos de pandemia, né? Nem bons, nem ruins, bons e ruins, né? E nos propor, ao final, essa atitude de escuta, de pausa, de nos permitirmos não saber exatamente o que sentimos, ou se sequer sentimos em alguns dias, né? Então, a gente foi acompanhando aqui as reações das pessoas que nos acompanham, que falavam de tristeza, e agora de alegria, e outra hora de cansaço, e outra hora de agonia, né? Eu tenho me perguntado muito sobre essa condição nova do professor, né? De nós, professores, sentados, né? Em uma cadeira, diante de uma tela, em que o nosso corpo se limita a essa parte, né? Somos um rosto que olha para uma tela e fala com a tela, né? E nos emocionamos em ver pessoas queridas, né? aparecendo nessa tela. Então, eu acho que você traz contribuições muito, muito importantes. Aqui tem alguém no chat dizendo que é uma espécie de angústia docente, né? E enquanto eu ouvia você também, eu lembrava muito da sua apresentação ano passado no Congresso de História das Emoções, né? Em que foi surpreendente começar a sua apresentação com um vídeo em que você aparece, né, no quarto, sentada na cama, com a vida em desordem, né? E a partir daí, né, toda uma reflexão sobre a depressão, né? E sobre a depressão, tanto do ponto de vista da subjetividade, mas, sobretudo, nessa dimensão que procura extrair da patologia, da dimensão medicalizada, né, daquilo que sentimos. Eu acho que esse é um tema extremamente fecundo para os dias que nós vivemos e gostei muito dessa ideia que você traz de pensar as palavras-chave da pandemia, né? Quais são as palavras-chave que cercam aí as nossas vidas e os múltiplos sentidos, as múltiplas dimensões que essas palavras-chave nos convocam a cada dia, né? A gente tem vivido bombardeado não só por imagens muito desafiadoras, né? Como foram as imagens das pilhas de corpos, das filas de carros que levavam os corpos para serem cremados ou enterrados, com a curva de mortalidade, você nas suas escritas tem chamado atenção para isso, né? Para essa responsabilidade com o achatamento da curva e como é que isso nos convoca. Então, eu vi que você perdeu uma parte da nossa conversa inicial, né? Eu terminava na apresentação que eu fiz, né, do seu trabalho, chamando atenção para um outro aspecto daquela entrevista sua com a Marta Bel Wasserman, em que você diz que uma forma de lidar com o entorpecimento mortal seria construir hábitos diários de sobrevivência, né? Que é uma prática que nos faria avançar, e apontando para o uso da arte, para a escuta, né? Ou quaisquer ferramentas que tenhamos para criar sociabilidade é realmente importante, tanto na dimensão íntima como em uma dimensão mais ampla, né? E eu queria ouvir um pouco mais de você sobre essa perspectiva, acho que você já vai anunciando, mas como é que isso está presente aí nesse grupo de sentimentos públicos com o qual você está interagindo. Me chama muita atenção também no seu trabalho, e aí nesse trecho que eu li, isso está bem presente, mas essa interlocução que você estabelece em suas investigações com vários pesquisadores, e a sua produção ela é marcadamente uma produção coletiva, né, em que comparecem vários pesquisadores, artistas e militantes. E uma outra dimensão que também me chama muita atenção e que aparece, né, na sua apresentação são essas várias linguagens de que você lança a mão para comunicar os resultados das suas investigações, que incluem a escrita, mas também a produção de vídeos, as exposições, as performances. Então, enquanto o nosso público vai nos mandando aí as perguntas, gostaria de explorar um pouco mais essas questões com você.
Yes, thank you. That's a beautiful summary of some of what I said. So thank you for reading back to me. Just to pick up on the point about daily practices. Yes, I haven't looked at that interview with Marta Bell Wasserman for a very long time, and so it's interesting to hear you mention that sentiment about developing practices of survival from something that I think it's from 2012. So it's quite some time ago, and yet still relevant for this time that we are living in now. And that has been striking to me, is that the same practices of survival that I have had to develop um, to combat forms of, let's say, despair or depression are actually serving me very well during this time of pandemic. And this is why I also was mentioning the resources of HIV/AIDS activists. So, what are the resources of those who have lived with illness for a long time, or with the danger and the risk or the fear of illness? This is where I also draw from Black feminisms and from those who have documented the histories of those who have survived under very challenging circumstances across many decades and centuries. And so here we are trying to figure out what tools we have. And you're right that one of my important practices as an academic, and you were mentioning the condition of being the scholar or the teacher who's just staring at the screen, right? But how do we use those tools that are available to us in the best possible way? And so for me, in the same way that I think about a physical practice or a bodily practice, so too I think about a writing practice as something that both makes it possible for me to remain in solitude, as we are having to do right now, but also because of Zoom, or because of being able to share texts or documents or other forms of communication back and forth. I have found it so valuable to have this meeting once a month with this group. There's 7 of us, and I don't think anyone has missed a meeting in these 7 months, because it is a bit of a lifeline for us to be like, okay, we're still here, 1 month later. This happened, that happened, and here we are. So those kinds of tools of coming together, very important. I have another little group. It's 3 of us. We're all writers, but I'm the only academic. And we share through a Google Doc every morning. We just write a little bit to each other. And that we've been doing for actually over 2 years now. So we already had that connection, and it has been very helpful during the pandemic, even though sometimes I think, oh no, it's this connection is going to break down because, each one of us is struggling in some way. In fact, one of the people I am in connection with through that document is based in Minneapolis and is an activist. So George Floyd's murder, and being in communication with someone who was living with extreme stress and anxiety, with National Guard on the street, cops on the street. They were very worried about violence. And it's been a very stressful time. So being able to stay connected has been important. And this is not to say that it's not difficult. I don't want to make this sound too much of a utopia or silver lining. It's simply like this is what we can do to survive. So I'm very interested in whatever daily practices work for us, because the same things that work during a pandemic are important at any time. And really all we have are each other. That's, that is the tool of the people, for the people, by the people. So this question of the social, it seems to me, is so very important right now. Also, you mentioned it's true that actually I wanted to do a little bit more research on this before I came to you today, but I didn't have time, just to check and see what the reports from Brazil are in the, let's say, mainstream media, or let's say the New York Times or the Guardian, right? So how are we sharing information through media how are we perhaps sharing information through other more informal mechanisms or alternative mechanisms. So I may not have the total picture here, but I feel like there have been a lot of pictures in the media of death and of cemeteries and graves, specifically in Brazil, as well as other parts of Latin America. And so I wonder how those images of death are functioning, both as they circulate globally, but also what does it mean to be there? This is another place where there's a not knowing or an uncertainty in the pandemic, is that we are in the midst of death that we cannot grieve fully right now. All of us, in some way, shape, or form. For everyone, it's different. You know, I am very lucky that I have not lost any immediate family and friends, but also in the US, there is similar actually to HIV/AIDS, when, you know, the president would not say the name AIDS in the 1980s. And under the presidency of Trump, there has been no acknowledgement of death. And that is cruel. My understanding is Bolsonaro has also been very casual about the pandemic in some of the same ways. So our political leaders have failed us. And so it, again, falls to the people to invent strategies of mourning. Again, I know perhaps I'm returning to it very insistently here, but it's one of the points of reference for me, is the invention of different strategies of grieving through queer forms of mourning. And so I think we have to do that now. I have a friend who has created in New York a project called Naming the Lost, where people have been creating these impromptu memorials in different places outside of hospitals, in their front yards. You know, this is also actually a very Catholic tradition, and one that I think of as coming from the Americas is the informal altar, is creating these memorials to the dead. And so people have had to take into their own hands the work of mourning in this time, sometimes by Zoom, sometimes through other rituals. So I think that will be another one of the stories that we need to share about this time, is how do we deal with grief, and also how do we deal with postponed grief. That's why I appreciated, Eloisa, that you said you picked up on what I was saying about needing time because we don't always know how we feel. And I think that has to be allowed for as well. Okay, I'll stop there. Maybe that's given people enough time to actually think a little bit about what they're feeling. And I know sometimes it's can feel awkward to be asking questions across languages, but hopefully people will have some things they would like to say. I welcome your comments as well. It doesn't have to be a question.
Anne, nós temos aqui no chat uma pergunta do professor Antônio Carlos Amorim, que é o nosso coordenador de pós-graduação em educação. E então ele diz muito obrigado pela sua conferência, e chama a atenção que ele considera fascinante a possibilidade de pensarmos sobre um arquivo de emoções e sentimentos no tempo presente, que se abre para um tempo indefinido, de risco e também de incertezas. E aí ele diz que com suas experimentações em múltiplos meios, as escritas, os vídeos, a performance, você pensa que da pandemia derivará um portal para a criação de outras linguagens novas, ainda não existentes?
Mm. Yes, I think so. I hope so. I mean, that is something I welcome. But it's interesting too, as I think about it. Um, we don't know when or what will be the time that we could call after the pandemic. It may be that we are just in an ongoing present or portal to something else. And so I have appreciated also um, the possibility to do this work now. That is to make culture and art now, or the example of my practice with the public feelings group of just meeting once a month and just trying to say how it's going for us right now. We're academics and scholars, so part of saying how we feel is also going to include, probably, as you see in my writing, different kinds of theoretical tools and efforts to think more analytically, but it's still very tentative, or sometimes still very unshaped or unformed. So perhaps also there is a kind of what we could call a work in progress aspect to developing these new languages. It's also why I really do love to take up these feeling keywords, and explore them. So any feeling word that someone puts in the chat could be the opportunity to explore. And this is where verbal arts, Eloisa was referring. I thought about showing it, Eloisa, but it would just, I was worried about technical difficulties for showing the alphabet of feeling bad. But it remains, I think, a relevant tool of just generating words for how we're feeling. Um, I'm thinking too of those who have been producing art in this moment. Again, because I interviewed him recently, I've referred to Greg Bordowitz. He has a show. He's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he has asked different poets to come together to read in this time. So that's, I want, I haven't, I that's a good example. And then uh, the other artist who's been very important to me right now is the musician Toshi Regan. Um, she's a Black queer musician based in New York. She did a post-election show called No Matter What, that was a kind of act of joy and survival in the night after the election, when we still didn't know the results. So on November 4th. And she has been doing an opera version with her mother, Bernice Johnson Regan, who is part of the group Sweet Honey in the Rock, which is a very important Black lesbian feminist group from the 1970s. And her mother has done also a lot of work on the history of gospel music, soul music, various African diasporic music traditions, which are, of course, also very important in a Brazilian context as well. So Toshi is a little bit the child of many musical traditions, and and her mother have been developing an opera version of the Black sci-fi writer Octavia Butler's work called The Parable of the Sower. It's amazing, and it's been shown um, by video during the pandemic. Uh, if you don't know Octavia Butler's work, it's also very important. It's been important to the feminist theorist Donna Haraway. It's a kind of post-apocalyptic vision of being able to live in times of decline. And Octavia Butler appears to have been a kind of visionary for a dystopia that also may be the best we can expect to live in. and the adaptation of Octavia Butler's work to this opera form is very interesting to me in terms of arts and culture and moving across media from writing to song to staged performance to media documentation and so on. So these have been some of the artworks and practices that are being produced now during the time of the pandemic that are going to be, again, for me at least, important tools to carry us forward. Thank you. I think I also wanted to say something about risk. I think that was in your question as well, and it's come up at other points because along with uncertainty, the capacity to live with risk and uncertainty is, again, something that would it's almost like building muscles, right? It's like it's a physical process of like being able to tolerate anxiety, uncertainty, stress. These are always good tools to have, and especially now. And I think some of the worst responses to the pandemic have come from a fear that is driven by wanting things to be certain. So this is again where, as a people, the more we can live with loss, uncertainty, negative affects, the stronger we will be in order to address these apocalyptic things that are going to be coming for us in the decades to come, I think, because of climate change. I mean, what's going on in Brazil with the forests and indigenous people is terrible for all of us. So again, this is again where we need to have these connections where people are on the ground in certain ways that also are meaningful for all of us. We knew we needed to craft these kinds of global connections anyway, even before the pandemic, because of the climate change issues that are going on. So this is, a moment that we must seize if we are to survive as a people.
Obrigada, Anne. Nós temos mais duas perguntas. Tem alguém que diz, professora, obrigada por suas palavras. Foi muito boa a sua conferência. A mercantilização do bem-estar e a busca por alta performance, com a necessidade de se mostrar feliz o tempo todo, né? Inclusive diante das adversidades, parece ser algo impactante na juventude brasileira. Então, eu gostaria que a senhora falasse um pouco sobre o conceito de depressão política, pois me parece que o mundo moderno traz consigo uma espécie de punição àqueles que muitas vezes não sabem lidar com situações pesadas, como a crise econômica e social que atinge tantas famílias. E tem alguém que diz, professora, grata pelas palavras, até que ponto você considera que a separação, né, eu estou entendendo aqui o isolamento, o distanciamento social colocado pela pandemia, cria segregações maiores entre classes sociais, por exemplo, ou mesmo contribui para aumentar o racismo. Tem um outro aqui, Adriana, no chat do Pedro Henrique, que ele diz que, Anne, você fala sobre sentimentos na pandemia, e aí o Pedro diz assim, mas como você, como professora e pesquisadora, sente, né, em relação a essa nova realidade? Fala que está com saudade de você e agradece por sua resposta.
Great. Yeah, even though I'm on my phone, I'm able to see the chat, but I see some of the questions are in Portuguese, but that one was in English. Just going back for a minute to the one about young people in Brazil, can you help me again to just repeat what the question was implying about the current state for youth? that they're feeling depression or?
A pergunta é sobre esse conceito de depressão política, chamando atenção para essa exigência de se mostrar feliz o tempo todo, né? E das dificuldades de expressar os bad feelings.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting that this seems to be something that is shared across political and cultural borders, similar to the way in which, particularly actually with the widespread circulation of antidepressants, we saw also the creation of a kind of epidemic of depression that then would be cured by Prozac and other medications. And now some of that same epidemic of feeling bad culturally, the focus seems to be on youth, because I see it here also in North America, where particularly in the academy, the reports of anxiety and depression amongst young people are enormous, and since the pandemic also even higher. And of course this is affected by categories of race and class as well. Here in Canada, in addition to the problem I mentioned earlier of high rates of death and disappearance amongst Indigenous women, the rates of suicide amongst Indigenous youth are, again, astronomical, just shocking. The number of young people who are killing themselves. It's a contemporary form of genocide, really. And so, yes, I think this is very concerning. And I think, as the question mentions, this kind of pressure to feel happy is also contributing to the problem. People are so unclear about even what they are supposed to be feeling. So there's, some norm that is circulated via social media, and then a sense of alienation and despair. So we are failing young people in so many ways, and I don't have an answer. I can feel, gosh, as our time goes by, and I think as I get more tired, I can see myself like trying to suggest some paths forward, including, uncertainty and humility. And then your questions are such important and urgent ones, right? That no one scholar, particularly not me, could have an answer or a solution. But I think together, just naming some of the problems is very, very important. And this question of young people is indeed a very, very important one, especially for any of us who are teachers or also parents. Is again, this is an area where we need to be asking young people what is going on for you, or be in conversation with them in order, again, to build these tools for resilience or for just survival in daily life, because it's another zone of just disposability, right? So the pandemic has revealed Black and brown bodies are disposable. Older people are disposable, and then it seems that young people also are a precarious population that is being neglected by our public health policies, our social policies. And I think this is where I find very limiting medical diagnoses, because we need to have a cultural analysis and a cultural set of tools. I will say also, this is part of I didn't have time to really discuss it today, but another area for my work going forward, this was something I was thinking about even before the pandemic, but I'm thinking about it even more now, is following up on the work I was doing on depression. I've been very interested in disability politics, and also these are some other keywords that have become very prevalent during the pandemic is mutual aid. And gosh, translator, I don't know if there's a key Portuguese word, but mutual aid, it comes out of anarchist organizing, has become very popular, and also notions of care or collective care as a political concept. So what are ways in which we can help each other, and also help each other with respect to feelings, mental health, sensibility. So there's now within young activist circles in North America, kind of interesting emphasis on mental health and self-care that I find very important. And it draws from disability justice and draws from other tools for thinking about how we create movements that don't leave people behind. And so I think that work is very important for working with young people. The tools for thinking about issues of mental health and different kinds of access in institutions is another place I'm trying to do some work. And definitely the pandemic has created kind of new urgencies around this. Then I think that leads nicely to that other question. I'm just going back to the chat about my own feelings and being a teacher and researcher in this new pandemic reality. I think I've addressed that a bit implicitly by talking about my interests in writing practices, performance, arts, and so on. The thing that's been most valuable for me as a researcher is creating conversations. So the possibility I mentioned earlier of being able to participate in doing oral histories so that we're in conversation about how we're surviving and actually archiving and documenting those conversations is important. That's been helpful. And because also I found myself very interested in that project because I really like being able to do interviews or oral histories face to face. So experimenting with whether I could do a meaningful interview through Zoom was quite important because I can't go into the field right now. And then as a teacher, so I've been doing administration work because I'm director of women's and gender studies. And so I have not been teaching this fall, but I will be teaching a course in the new year, which I'm calling, similar to my topic for today, public feelings in a time of pandemic. So I think I will have an opportunity to work in the classroom. I have also been visiting classes by Zoom, and that's been really valuable. I do really find these group conversations where we can try to figure out what's going on for us, I find is very life affirming. Even if what we're sharing is feeling bad, you know, that it helps me. And I have also been organizing programming at my institution, similar to what you're doing, I think, through this series, is being able to gather together and acknowledge what's going on and share ideas has been very important. And I have liked it when they've been very small scale events, like maybe just I don't know, 8 or 10 people where there's enough time to go around and see like, okay, how are you feeling about this? And then we kind of generate some ideas collectively just by starting with how it is that we're feeling. Okay. Was there something I missed? Remind me again, because I think there might have been one more question that I haven't explicitly answered.
Não, Anne, você trabalhou com todas as questões, a gente está já no limite do tempo, então me cabe agradecer muitíssimo pela sua disponibilidade para estar aqui conosco, para, como você acabou de dizer, criar uma conversação conosco, que nós esperamos muito que seja apenas a primeira de muitas. Foi uma tarde muito rica de trabalho, e então nós queríamos agradecer a você pela sua disponibilidade, ao professor Antônio Carlos por todo o apoio que o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Educação nos deu para a realização desse evento, as pessoas que estão aqui conosco, a Ana Porto, a Alexandrina e Laís, dando suporte a esse trabalho, e ao trabalho valioso da Adriana e da equipe do Instituto, que está fazendo possível esse trabalho à distância, né? Então, muito obrigada e receba um abraço muito especial do Brasil, na expectativa de muito mais futuros possíveis.
Thank you. I am so appreciative. It is an honor. And I special thanks to Adriana, because I know I gave you a lot to have to translate, and if we weren't having the technical difficulties, I probably would have required some more pauses for you. So I'm very grateful. I look forward to seeing the YouTube. If someone could save the chat, will someone save the chat and perhaps send it to me, because it's hard to do from my phone. Even if it's in Portuguese, it's okay. I would like to have the record of the chat. And yes, feelings from Ottawa to you. So we'll meet again, I hope, and please take care, everyone. Ciao.
Tchau, Anne, muito obrigada.